Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty interesting, a recent opinion piece. And it really challenges some of the common ideas that we hear about the conflict in Ukraine. Basically, it argues that it's not all on President Putin. It suggests that both Ukrainians themselves and former President Biden, they share some of the responsibility for what's been happening.
Yeah, and you know what really got me right off the bat with this piece was who wrote it. Like we're talking about Alan Cooperman, a professor at UT Austin. He's like a specialist in military strategy and conflict resolution. And right at the beginning, he says something that's kind of unexpected, like he rarely agrees with President Trump. So you get the sense that he's going to offer a perspective that might go against the mainstream narrative.
Absolutely. And it's this whole idea that we in the West, for over a decade now, we've been given a maybe incomplete, maybe even misleading view of what's going on with Ukraine. And so his goal here is to kind of break it down into three main points that he thinks we need to understand to get the bigger picture of how this conflict came to be and why it's still going on.
Okay, so this first point, it takes us all the way back to 2014 and the violence that broke out back then. He argues that this violence, which led to Russia's first move into southeastern Ukraine, like with Crimea, it wasn't just random. He's saying it was actually ignited by Ukrainian right-wing radicals, armed radicals.
And remember, back then, Viktor Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine. He was considered pro-Russian, and he'd won, fair and square elections in 2010 with a lot of backing from the ethnic Russians who lived mostly in those southeastern parts of Ukraine.
Right. And then in 2013, there's this huge decision that Yanukovych makes. He decides to stick with closer economic ties with Russia instead of going with Europe. And as you can imagine, this really stirred up a lot of folks in Ukraine who were more pro-West.
And that's when you start to see these massive pro-Western protests in Kyiv, right, in Maidan Square. And activists are even occupying government buildings. But the piece really emphasizes that these protests, at least in the beginning, they were largely peaceful. And by mid-February 2014, President Yanukovych had actually given in to several of their demands. And so many of the protesters, they went home.
Yeah, but here's where it gets really, really interesting. The author, he claims that right-wing militants started firing from rooftops, targeting the remaining protesters and even the police. And then, of course, the police fired back at the militants.
And these militants, according to the author, they then falsely claimed that the government was massacring unarmed protesters. So this just blew everything up. Ukrainians, they were outraged, they besieged the capital, and in the end, Yanukovych was overthrown and fled to Russia.
And so the author's trying to show us that Putin's decision to send troops into Crimea and to start arming ethnic Russians in Donbass, those folks who believe their president had been unfairly ousted, it all has to be seen in the context of what happened in 2014.
He's careful to say that this context, it helps explain why Russia's move wasn't completely unprovoked. But he's also very clear that it doesn't justify Russia's actions at all. And then, his second main point, it focuses on Zelensky, the current Ukrainian president.
Yeah, so this is where it gets a bit controversial. The author argues that Zelensky actually escalated and made the conflict worse. He claims that Zelensky basically ignored peace agreements with Russia. He asked for military aid from the West, and he pushed for Ukraine to join NATO.
The peace agreements we're talking about here are the Minsk agreements, which were made in 2014 and 2015 when Zelensky's predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, was president. The goal of those agreements was to stop the fighting in southeast Ukraine and to protect the troops on both sides.
And a big part of the Minsk agreement, according to the author, was that Ukraine had to give Donbass a certain amount of political autonomy by the end of 2015. And the author believes that Putin saw this as a way to ensure Ukraine wouldn't join NATO or become a military base for the West.
But the author claims that for 7 years, Ukraine basically avoided doing what it had agreed to in the Minsk agreements. And then Zelensky comes along, and when he's running for president, he promises to implement these agreements and stop the bloodshed. But the author says that once he was president, he went back on his word.
And the author suggests that maybe Zelensky was more worried about looking strong and standing up to Russia than he was about avoiding a bigger conflict. He claims Zelensky's government actually started importing more weapons from NATO countries, and the author thinks this was a major turning point that made Putin really nervous.
Now, it's worth mentioning that the author does slip in an editorial comment here, pointing out that NATO's refusal to give Russia any security guarantees was also a big factor in all this tension, but his main focus is definitely on Zelensky's actions.
So then, on February 21st, 2022, the author says that Russia officially recognized Donbass as independent. Then they sent troops into Donbass, saying it was for peacekeeping. And at the same time, they told Zelensky to refuse any more military help from the West and to drop any plans of joining NATO. But Zelensky wouldn't do it, and so on February 24th, Putin launched a full-scale invasion.
So the author's point is that whether Zelensky meant to or not, his actions provoked Russia. But again, he emphasizes that this doesn't make what Russia did okay.
And there's another editorial note here where the author dismisses accusations of Russian war crimes as just propaganda. But we're sticking to the author's main arguments, right? So that brings us to his third point, which is all about Joe Biden's role in this whole thing.
This is where the author argues that Biden really contributed to the escalation and the fact that this conflict is still dragging on. He points to late 2021 when Putin had all those troops at the Ukrainian border and was demanding that Zelensky implement the Minsk agreements. The author claims that it was obvious then that if Zelensky didn't give in, Russia would invade to secure a land route between Donbass and Crimea.
And his point is that Ukraine relies heavily on U.S. military aid.
Right.
So the author says if Biden had told Zelensky he had to do what Putin wanted, Zelensky probably would have had to listen.
But the author says that Biden didn't do that. He left the decision up to Zelensky and even promised a swift and decisive response if Russia invaded. The author sees this as Biden giving Zelensky the green light to go ahead and defy Putin. The
author then goes on to compare this to what might have happened if Trump had been president. He believes Trump wouldn't have given Zelensky that much leeway, so Zelensky would have been forced to implement the Minsk agreements, which could have prevented the war altogether.
And even if Zelensky had still refused and Russia had invaded anyway, the author thinks Trump wouldn't have given Ukraine what he calls a veto power over peace talks. Like with that statement, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
And the author argues that this promise, it sadly encouraged Ukraine to keep fighting, hoping for major U.S. military help that Biden never fully delivered because he was afraid of starting a nuclear war.
So what he's saying is that Biden basically gave Ukraine false hope and made the conflict last way longer than it needed to, leading to countless deaths and barely any changes in who controls what territory. And he points out that the framework for a ceasefire seems pretty obvious. Russia keeps Crimea and parts of the southeast, while the rest of Ukraine doesn't join NATO but gets security guarantees from some Western countries.
Yeah, and the author thinks that a deal like that could have been made at least 2 years ago if Biden had only agreed to give Zelensky more military help on the condition that he agreed to ceasefire talks.
And the real tragedy, according to the author, is that any peace deal they make now will probably be worse for Ukraine than the Minsk agreements, which Zelensky threw away because the author thinks he was too ambitious politically and naively expected endless support from the U.S.
So basically, this whole opinion piece is pushing for a more nuanced view of how the conflict in Ukraine started and why it's still going on. It highlights how important the actions and decisions of not just Putin, but also Ukrainian leaders and Biden have been in shaping this situation.
So given everything we just talked about, how do you think different choices by those leaders could have changed things? And what does this analysis tell us about how to handle conflicts like this in the future? Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.